Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen. Chapter 9, page 91. It was curiosity. That's what Eddie decided when he thought about why he'd followed Jack Sim home a few days after their conversation. He wanted to know more about the man who came to the zoo almost every day of his life, and then spent his time sitting around watching kids at the playground. What kind of person did that? Where did he live? What did he do with the rest of his time? Eddie could have asked Jack Sim some of those questions, and maybe he would one day. But as far as where he lived, what kind of place it was, he could find that out just by following the man home. Eddie was good at following people. It was something he'd practiced back when he read all those Hardy Boys books and wanted to be a detective. Jack was easy to follow. He didn't look back once. In fact, he hardly even looked up. Mostly he just stared at the ground as he walked, like he was thinking hard about things. For a man who almost magically seemed to know all about Eddie's life at the zoo, he didn't appear to be particularly observant. They left the zoo over the swinging footbridge that led north, Eddie staying far enough back to avoid being recognized if Jack did turn around. It was only the second time in all the weeks he had been at the zoo that Eddie had left the place, and it felt good to be out and traveling around again. They crossed the busy freeway that bordered the perimeter of the zoo, then continued north. Eddie was glad Jack didn't look back, because for a while there were no houses or buildings to duck behind. Eventually they came to an older residential neighborhood. Eddie recognized it as Bridgeland. His aunt lived around here somewhere, although Eddie wasn't sure he could find the place on foot. He'd always gone there in a car. He passed what looked like a nursing home on his left, with the rubble of what had once been the general hospital behind it. Eddie remembered reading that a lot of people had been pissed off about the hospital being closed and eventually demolished as part of government cutbacks. Eddie didn't know much about politics, but the great gash in the landscape where they had once been a hospital was depressing. On his right was a school for the mentally handicapped. Just past the school, Jack Sim turned right, went slightly uphill for a block, and he turned left. Eddie hung back, then moved ahead slowly and carefully. When he reached the corner where Jack had made his second turn, Eddie didn't see anyone. For a minute he thought he'd lost the man, and he cursed under his breath. Then he heard a door close and spotted someone disappearing into a house on the left side of the street. He couldn't tell if it was Jack Sim or not. Eddie waited a few minutes, then crossed the street in order to stay behind the parked cars lining that side of the road. He stopped when he was directly across from the house he'd seen the person go into. He made a mental note of the number 111. As he looked at the house, he was sure that this was where Jack Sim lived. The house was small, and there were bushes everywhere in the front yard. One tall spruce tree stood on either side of the sidewalk that led up to the door. It was the kind of house that would be a piece of cake to break into. Lots of cover, the front door in shadow from the trees. Eddie figured he could get in and out of the place in broad daylight without anybody knowing. But would he? It wasn't that he wanted to steal anything from Jack, especially after the man had been pretty decent to him so far, but maybe there was something in the house that might offer a clue as to why the guy behaved the way he did. And besides, it was reasonable, wasn't it? If Jack Sim was a pervert, Eddie had a right to know. No, he needed to know, for his own safety. He made up his mind he'd do it tomorrow. No sense putting it off. While Jack Sim was sitting watching the kids at the playground, and he would see if he could find one more about the mystery man. He didn't get to put his plan into effect, at least not right away. The next day the weather turned bad again. This time there was snow mixed with the rain that fell for most of the day. There was one good thing that happened, though. Someone left a ski jacket lying on the table in the conservatory, probably while they went to the bathroom. Eddie looked quickly around, picked up the jacket, and hurried out of the building. He went straight back to the condo and stashed the jacket. He wouldn't be able to wear it, at least for a few days. The person who owned it used to own it. Eddie smiled. Would probably report it missing, and the security people would be on the lookout. He felt a little guilty about ruining the jacket owner's day, but he told himself that anybody who could afford a jacket like that could probably afford two. The ugly weather lasted only that day. The next morning was one of the warmest so far, and Eddie decided it was an ideal time to check out Jack's place. He took no chances, waiting until he spotted the old man sitting near the kids' playground before he left the zoo. He made a last stop at the concession stand with the hope of finding something decent left uneaten, or at least untended. Something he could take with him for the walk to Jack's house. This time he was unsuccessful. He'd have to make the walk to Bridgeland without a snack. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 20 minutes if you went straight at it, but Eddie deliberately took a roundabout route. Might as well kill two birds with one stone, he thought as he checked out potential B&E locations in the blocks around Jack's place. He settled on an infill-type house as a good candidate, particularly after he saw a woman leaving with a briefcase in hand. The woman drove off in a newer Jeep Grand Cherokee. Leather seats. Yes! Eddie liked the setup. The almost new house and the yuppie vehicle indicated money, and the fact that the woman carried a briefcase in hand suggested the house was likely to be vacant during the day. It wasn't a perfect target. There were no mature trees or bushes in the yard, and the house was on a narrow lot that put it almost up against its neighbors. But you couldn't have everything. Besides, he'd check the place out at least one more time before he made his move. As he got closer to Jack's, Eddie slowed his pace in order to get a good look at the houses on either side of 111 and across the street. He walked to the end of the block and turned the corner, never looking back. He'd learned long before that looking straight ahead and from side to side was okay, but looking back tended to draw attention. You looked nervous, which was never a good idea. When he reached the back lane that ran behind Jack's house, he turned again, now focusing his attention on the houses on the opposite side of the alley. There was no one outside cutting the lawn or hanging wash, and Eddie couldn't see anybody looking out a window. All seemed quiet. Time to make his move. He hopped the low wire fence that ran along the rear of Jack's property and headed quickly for the back door. He tried to turn the handle once in a while. You got lucky, but it was locked. Eddie faded into the shadows created by a stand of overgrown bushes at the corner of the house. He thought about the front door, recalling that it offered good cover, but he didn't like the idea that it faced the street. There were two windows in this part of the back wall. One was a main floor window. It sat directly over a smaller window that obviously led to the basement. Eddie chose the lower one. People tended to pay less attention to the security of their basement windows. Jack Sim was one of those people. The window was locked, but a pane of glass had been broken some time before and replaced with a piece of plywood. Whatever was holding the plywood in place, if anything wasn't very effective. Eddie took a glove out of his pocket. It was a glove he had made for himself after some advice from Ratsy. The palm was covered with an adhesive substance. You didn't want to push a pane of glass, or in the case wood, into the house where they would fall to the floor and make noise. Instead, you cut or broke them and drew them out with the sticky glove. This time, no cutting or breaking was needed. Eddie placed the glove against the plywood and pulled it out so easily. He was forced to smile. Either Jack Sim was a very trusting man, or he didn't have anything in the house worth stealing. Eddie reached inside the vacant window frame and quickly undid the fastener. One more swift look around, and Eddie began his feet first slide into the house and down onto the basement floor. Another small smile as he thought about how getting in and out of his condo was good practice for what he was doing now. His feet hit the floor. He dropped quickly into a crouch, looking and listening hard for anything that might provide a warning. An indication that something was wrong. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Safe and quiet. To his left, the pilot light of the furnace, and the staccato sound of his own breathing. Short, quick breaths. More from nervousness than exertion. This was always the scariest part. The first few seconds in the house. What if Jack's him lived with someone else, and that person was in the house now? Still no noise, at least none that needed to be feared. Eddie moved slowly toward the stairs, stopping after a few steps to listen again. Now he was certain there was no one here, no one but him. The basement didn't have much in it. A few cardboard boxes, a red metal toolbox, a pile of old magazines, and a broken wooden chair. Nothing to tell Eddie much about the man who lived here. It was funny that he felt so apprehensive about this particular break-in. Was it because he'd never broken into the house of anyone he knew before? Even though he wasn't planning to steal anything, there was something about what he was doing that felt more wrong than when it was done to strangers. He started up the stairs to the main floor. A couple of steps creaked and he stopped after each unwelcome sound. He wasn't fearful now, just curious. There was no need for fear. He'd done this enough to know the danger signs and to know when things were okay. They were okay this time. At the top of the stairs, Eddie stopped and looked around the corner into the kitchen. Satisfied, he ducked low to avoid being seen through the window and started across the floor. He stopped in the middle of the tiny room and glanced around. It was fairly neat. Cupboards along one wall, sink below the window. There was no room for a table. Several bananas sat, yellow and inviting, on the counter next to the sink. Eddie couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a banana. There were 6. Did people keep track of something like bananas? He decided they didn't and broke his vow not to take anything from Jack's house. He tore one banana from the bunch and stuffed it into his pocket. Still laying low, he made his way to the living room and again peeked around the corner before moving farther. His eyes scanned the room with practiced precision. taking it in quickly and thoroughly. The curtains that covered the room's lone window were closed. They were heavy with a print pattern of flowers and windmills that Eddie was sure had been out of style for a long time. No one would see him, though. These curtains, he'd be able to move around without having to crouch. He eased his way around the corner, straightened up, and looked around again, this time for detail. He was standing next to a Chesterfield, old like the curtains. There was a small black and white television perched on a TV tray and sitting against the front door. Eddie was glad he had decided to come in through the basement window. The room was spare and dull. There were no pictures on the walls, no bookcases, none of the little knickknacks people normally had on the shelves. In fact, there weren't any shelves. A second TV tray was folded up against the far end of the couch. A big closet-looking cupboard stood in one corner, bringing to a total of 3. The pieces of furniture in the room, not counting the TV trays. No wonder the man spent all his time at the zoo. This had to be the most boring house on the planet. There was one thing that seemed completely out of place. A glass-topped wooden case sat on the floor, almost out of sight behind the couch. Eddie crossed the room and bent down for a look. Inside were rows of knives. 4 rows, 5 knives in each row. They came in different shapes and sizes. The smaller knives, some no bigger than a jackknife, were along the top of the case. Below them were larger ones, including one that stretched from one end of the case to the other. No, 2 knives had the same handle, but they all had one thing in common. All of them looked expensive, and each was polished so well that it shone, even in the room's dim light. "Damn," Eddie whispered to himself. "I could live for 6 months on money I'd get from one of those." But something stopped him from opening the glass and picking up one of the knives. Something told him that these meant more to Jack than anything else he owned, which wasn't saying much given the quality of the stuff in the room. Still, the knives seemed personal somehow, and Eddie didn't feel comfortable even being this close to them. He straightened up. There was another doorway leading to a room off to the right. Eddie almost decided not to bother with it, but changed his mind. He'd come all this way, and so far had learned almost nothing about the man who seemed to know so much about him. Might as well see it all. The room was obviously the bedroom, and if Jack Sim was some kind of pervert, it made sense that the bedroom might offer up the evidence. Eddie crossed the living room and looked through the doorway. The room was dark, with no window to offer any outside light. The light from the living room allowed him to get a general idea of the layout. The room was small, not much more than a glorified closet. In fact, Eddie was pretty sure it had probably been a closet at one time. A narrow bed, neatly made, took up most of what space there was. At the foot of the bed was a desk with a wooden chair, the kind that folds up, shoved part way into the opening under the surface. There was a lamp and other stuff, too. But Eddie couldn't make it out in the dark. He crossed to the lamp. He could risk turning it on in there. There was no chance anyone outside would see the light. He turned on the light and stepped back, slowly taking in a breath, then holding it for a long time. He suddenly wished he hadn't come at all. He was right to have been suspicious of Jack Sim. The walls were covered with pictures of children. Little girls. The biggest concentration was directly over the desk, and there were more pictures of the desk itself. Some were snapshots, all of them black and white, but just as many were clippings from newspapers, old newspapers, with paper the yellow of dying grass. Eddie leaned forward and studied the pictures. The girls were young, much younger than Eddie. They had to be 6, maybe 7 years old. The pictures weren't pornographic. In fact, most of them looked like family photos. Maybe Jack had stolen them. But why would somebody do that? And why were all the pictures so old? And then it was clear. It was the newspaper clippings that told him. And as he read, Eddie felt the same way he had when he'd read Ratsy's essay in the Young Offenders Center. He thought he might throw up. He took deep breaths and willed himself not to. It helped that there was nothing in his stomach to get rid of, but repulsed as he was by the story that was so carefully laid out in front of him, Eddie couldn't pull himself away. He had to read it. Had to read it all. He had to know it all. He slowly eased himself into the folding chair. The pictures weren't of different girls. They were all of the same girl, some including other people, but most were of her alone. Many were repeats of other pictures, sometimes larger or smaller. Eddie looked at the wall over the bed. It looked like some of his friends' bedroom walls, especially the guys, with dozens of pictures of a favorite athlete or rock singer. Except the little girl in these pictures wasn't an athlete or rock singer. The torn newspaper clipping taped on the wall directly in front of Eddie told the story. The headline was in huge, bold letters, "Child Slain." Eddie looked again and again at the largest picture of the girl. It was right below the headline. She was happy, smiling for the camera. Maybe a parent or a teacher had snapped the photo. The details of the girl's death were laid out on both sides of the picture, and below the caption that took Eddie's breath and didn't give it back for what seemed like a very long time. The battered and sexually abused body of Angela Sim, aged 8, was found yesterday in a wooded area at the eastern ledge of St. George's Island, not far from the zoo. Still, Eddie stayed and read. There were clippings spanning several months, and they told the whole story. The murder had taken place in 1959, almost 45 years earlier, and it had been savage. The killer had lured the girl away from the playground at the zoo not long before dark. No one knew at first what happened to Angela Sim, just that she had disappeared. Hundreds of searchers combed the area, but the girl's body wasn't found for 2 days. More than 500 people attended the funeral, most of whom never knew Angela Sim. The killer remained at large for several months. He was eventually caught, but not before he had killed another girl, this one in Saskatchewan. The news of his capture was caused to interrupt a baseball game at Calgary's Old Buffalo Stadium on this Sunday afternoon. The public address announcer broke the news to the crowd, and the game was held up for almost 10 minutes as people stood and applauded. The murderer had quickly been found guilty and sentenced to life. He died of undetermined causes after only 3 years in prison. It was all there. The reporters had obviously worked hard on the story, and they left little untold. The Sim family had lived in Bridgeland for a dozen years. Eddie noted the address and calculated that it couldn't have been more than a few blocks from where Jack Sim lived. Now, Mr. Sim had been a salesman. He and his wife had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Angela was the second youngest. There was another photograph, also from a newspaper, that forced Eddie to look at it again and again. And each time he looked, Eddie felt his eyes fill with tears, even though it was only picture Angela Sim was not in. It had been taken only days after Angela's body was found. It looked as if the photographer had asked the family to pose in the living room of their home, and on the far right, trying to smile, as he must have thought you were supposed to when you were having your picture taken for the newspaper, was Angela Sim's older brother, 12-year-old Jack.